I'm Barry Grosbach.
And I'm Mike Hardy.
Lived in this house since 1970.
I've lived there since then too. Well, we both started at Community College of Philadelphia, which started in 1965, right? And we met each other at that time as the first class of teachers at the Community College of Philadelphia, right? And we both taught the same courses, American history, and we sort of swapped the chairmanship of the history department back and forth, and
we moved out here with help from colleagues who I was chair at the time, so they felt a certain sense of obligation to help us move.
Right.
It was in their interest to do so, and so we moved on Christmas Eve. It was a very long move. We came into this house, we dropped packages, boxes all over the place, and a good friend of ours, who was a colleague at community college and was studying for the ministry, took us out for a Christmas Eve service that he had to participate in New Jersey. And we promptly fell asleep while it was going on, and we got back here at 3 o'clock in the morning and slept on the floor. That was the introduction to this house. We did. We actually looked at the Fairmont area, and
why did we not choose the Fairmont area?
well, a couple of reasons. One, we didn't feel particularly comfortable. We had a realtor who was kind of old school and was not particularly receptive to showing two guys around, and we felt that, and we also looked around, and the area was pretty barren, and we were interested in trees and greenery, and it just didn't have any, and so that was one of the deciding factors. And the other possible alternative was Germantown, Mount Airy, which has always been the alternative to University City for a lot of people. And since we didn't want to have a car, we were concerned with public transportation and walkability, and so this area met those goals.
As you well know, there are 4 trolley lines that service University City, and we're only a block away from 4 of them. It was a rough choice because we had been driven down this block, right? And across the way, it fundamentally was a Calcutta of University City of West Philadelphia. Because it was all absentee landlords. There was trash everywhere. The weeds would grow up all over the place, and we thought, we're not going to look at that, right? And in this house, but this house, we suddenly realized, Lois Spy was a realtor we were dealing with, and she said, you know, I must show you this house. Please let me show you the house. So we saw the house, and we sat over there, right? And then we convinced ourselves that this was a great house for us, because it had been turned around and we wouldn't have to look at the other side of the street, right, except when we went out. And
it was also at that time, Lois despaired of ever being able to sell the house. And Lois Spy, for people who don't know, she and George Funderburg started Urban Developers, and Lois was a very big, long-time supporter of the University City Historical Society. She was involved with it and involved with house tours and all kinds of things. But she despaired of being able to sell the house because it was the highest priced house that she had in her listings. It was listed for $35,000 at the time. And but you know, it had just been totally gutted. A student in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania bought it for like $7,000. He worked on it for 8 years, and he never got a chance to live in it because he got a job teaching at Brooklyn College, and he had to leave, and it was pretty traumatic for him. But he just did a great job, and it just was the kind of configuration that was satisfying for us. I was always amused in subsequent years when people from the Historical Society would come over here. They were always stunned that we didn't live in a Victorian house, given Mike's involvement with the Historical Society.
Even though he kept the front of the house,
Yeah.
like all the rest on the block.
But they were always just so stunned. This was not in character in terms of what they expected they would find in a house that we lived in. So, but it's been an ideal residence for us. It was move-in. We did a lot of the cosmetic work. We did a lot of wood stripping, but structurally everything was here. All the mechanicals were in. An exquisite staircase, which you don't find staircases like this any longer in houses that are built today. This is as sturdy and with. I mean, it's just. He did a great job. He really did a great job.
And he was also required to essentially put tile on the third floor bathroom because he had linoleum or something on the walls.
Well, we're going for an FHA mortgage, and they had certain requirements, and not only did he put tile on, but he asked us if we wanted to pick out the tile that he should put on. So he was a pleasure to work with, and we really felt sorry for him that this labor of love was a place that he never got to experience. So, but we feel that he should feel good that it ended up in good hands.
I was glad that we were close to them. I went to the University of Pennsylvania for graduate school.
Okay.
And so I was aware of what it was. Even though essentially we were encouraged not to go this far because it was too close to the rest of West Philadelphia.
Dangerous.
And dangerous, right, dangerous. And there was a couple next door by the name of the Richters, and she essentially spent a lot of her time in the third floor bedroom, and Barry would take over food and that sort of thing for her. So we knew we had good neighbors.
The advantage to living in the area, and I think that's been proven over the years. One, because we were both involved in education, it was always stimulating. We did a lot of walking, and it was always stimulating to be able to walk through campus. You felt as if you were in an intellectual and academic environment, and that was really something that was important to me to have that sense of things. And also, maybe I didn't think about it at the time, but I've become acutely aware of how West Philadelphia has benefited from the fact that, and some people would not agree, but the fact that you have Penn, the fact that you have Drexel, the fact that you have the University of the Sciences, the fact that you have this incredible medical complex. This area has all of these institutional anchors, which really makes it almost resistant to the kind of downturns that a lot of neighborhoods would have, because it's in the interest of all of these institutions to keep things on an even keel, not let things deteriorate, because that impacts on their own physical environment. So if you look at other areas of the city, they just don't have that advantage. And the fact that these institutions feel some necessity to protect their own environment is indicated when these organizations got together and formed the Unveristy City District. They did that out of self-preservation. It wasn't just an altruistic move on their part, but they did it to protect their own environment. So I know that I never went to Penn. I never had any connection with Penn and never earned a paycheck from Penn. But when we moved out here, Penn was the 800-pound gorilla. And a lot of people just had nothing positive to say about it.
No.
And I could, from my own activity in Spruce Hill, understand why, because in the early years that we were here, there was no outreach on the part of the university toward the community. And in fact, it was almost as if the university had built a kind of wall, and there was just sharp separation. The classic tale that we have out here is when Meyerson, who was president at the time, who lived in Center City in a townhouse.
On Delancey Street.
When Penn introduced a mortgage program, it applied for purchases of houses in Center City and not out here. And we had a board meeting at that time at Spruce Hill, and people were just climbing the walls and screaming and attacking Penn with language that can't be repeated. And some of these people were employed at the university. They worked there, they were on faculty and staff, and the hostility toward the university on the part of its own members was really quite remarkable, and I was impressed by that. And so I think that the attitude toward the university began to change when Sheldon Hackney came in and restored some dialogue and was really very positive in terms of his attitude toward the neighborhood. And so I think that there was a sea change when Hackney came in the 80s.
Well, I had lived around the block, and so I've always been in University City.
Okay.
And then I lived on 48th Street in a house in which we essentially had. I was with another guy, and we had bought the ability to move things into the basement, and. So when I met Barry, I was still there.
Well, I'm
Downtown.
not a native Philadelphian, so when I arrived in I came from doing my master's and doctoral work at Indiana University in Bloomington,
Okay.
and my first job was teaching at Westchester, and so I came to Philadelphia, and I didn't want to live in Westchester, so I rented an apartment on the 4000 block of Sansom Street. And that was my introduction to Philadelphia and to being a renter from a landlord. I drove to Westchester every day, and I did that for a year, and then community college opened, and so I then moved into Center City and had an apartment down in Delancey Street, and lived there for 5 years until we moved out here. So my first living in Philadelphia was here in West Philadelphia for a year. That was an interesting experience because I came home one day from my teaching classes, and my apartment had been turned upside down and the walls were being opened up. The owners of the property had forgotten to put the venting up to the upper floors so that people would have heat, so they were reconstructing the interior of the building. That was my introduction to landlording in Philadelphia, and it was something that I remember distinctly, because the landlord was also a member of the Spruce Hill board and a chronic complainer, and so that was my introduction to local politics.
Across the street now, those are all single-family houses, and when they're apartment houses still, they have very responsible landlords, and so that's totally changed, right?
Well, the biggest thing that changed it was the school, the Penn Alexander School.
Yeah, the Penn Alexander School.
Out of all the things that Penn has done out here, the school has made the biggest difference, because it encouraged people to look at the neighborhood. Houses across the street that were investment properties are now single-family houses because that's where the demand was for people to live in the catchment area. So the area became attractive to potential homeowners with families, which had never been the case before. Biggest problem that we always had in Spruce Hill was when people came in and they were attached to the university or they were just working somewhere in the city. As soon as they had kids, when the kids became school age, if they couldn't afford to send them to private school, they left the city because of the quality or lack thereof of public education. You get run over.
Right.
You get run over by.
You get run over by perambulators. Right?
Yes. Yeah, totally changed, and but still, people have to realize that because of all of the investment properties and all of the things that were turned into investment properties in this neighborhood in the 50s and 60s, particularly in Spruce Hill, because we are adjacent to Penn and we're adjacent to the University of the Sciences, and that's where the money was. Spruce Hill has about a 19% home ownership, and that is way below Cedar Park and Garden Court, simply because we have so much of this neighborhood that was turned into investment properties in the 50s and 60s. None.
Charlie
moved in a few years after we did.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He bought a few years, but Charlie's the longest resident. He came a few years after we moved in here, but there is no one else around who, well, there was only one other homeowner other than the Richters who lived next door, and they passed away, and but there was only one other homeowner, and they left for New Hampshire shortly after we moved in, and they sold their properties to Charlie Hobb, and Charlie's lived here. But that's it. Everybody else is, of various different stages, but nobody else is original. There are some original folks on Baltimore Avenue. Students, for the most part.
Teachers. We were teachers,
yeah.
Right?
But mostly just, most of the people you didn't know. They were just people who were living in investment properties, and the properties were just miserable and they were run down. And for years, I took out all the trash for the properties across the street, put all the trash cans back because the owners wouldn't do it. And you either did that or you just looked at overflowing trash. It was an awful sight. It's not pretty. Oh, you know all your neighbors now. It's a very different environment.
Right.
Oh yeah, it's a very different, and you know neighbors on all the surrounding blocks.
We also know the people who live in the house in the corner, which we own, right? And there are 3 apartments, 2-bedroom apartments there. We converted it from 3 bedrooms to 2. So that fundamentally we didn't have a group home living there. And the occupants now, the renters now, every time they leave, they fundamentally find someone to replace them.
They never leave.
They never leave. The rents are pretty low.
Yeah, given the rents, they never leave. We never raise rents. Actually, we did. After 13 years, we did raise the rent by $25. But other than that, we just never, that's our philosophy on landlording. If you have good tenants and they consider it their home, then
they take care of the trash.
They take care of things. They leave it alone. They have a proprietary interest in the building, and the idea of just bumping up rents in order to, all you have is turnover and people who just treat it like that. And so, our tenants are kind of like family. Casper's was that's where we had our first meal. And that was the place that you went to because that was and that it was so Philadelphian. The waitresses all called you Hun, and it was a perfect caricature of the city. and and the food was good, but other than that, I can't remember a place. And there was a Penn Fruit that existed where Supreme is now, so I guess that was the supermarket. And there was this little A&P at 46th and Spruce, but short of that, I mean, I guess the worst house must have been here. I don't even remember that, but you didn't have a lot of places.
I remember the worst house because in the 1990s, we bought the house on the corner, and the reason why we bought it is the guy who was operating the worst house was threatening to buy it, and we said his idea was that he would remove the porch, or he would do it with glass block, and then he would paint everything black and red as you walked up the stairs. And we said, no, we're going to buy it, right? Even though it was fairly expensive, right, by our standards.
And in lousy shape.
And in lousy shape.
But no, there were not a lot of amenities out here.
Clark Park. Clark Park, essentially, when we moved in, the grass was this high. It was never cut. There was trash everywhere, and there was a dog that when the guy walking the dog, he would allow the dog to chew on the bark of the trees, which automatically would kill the trees as soon as he circled them. And I founded the Friends of Clark Park, and the way in which we got it going was I've heard about a woman who had been operating at Fiddler Square, and so we brought her in to give a talk to the neighbors here who we were thinking about bringing into the Friends of Clark Park. And I brought her in to be a speaker, and she, encouraged us to do it, but the assumption was it would take quite some time before anything would take place.
We made a conscious decision, and we talked about this, that rather than spin our wheels in the same organizations, we would each get involved in different ones, and just spread our efforts around. And I think it also reflected our particular interests. So I was on the Spruce Hill board, and became involved in zoning issues, and became involved with the Unveristy City District from the beginning, and we had formed...
He was on the board of the Unveristy City District, still is.
We had formed a special service district out here prior to that, because I got so tired of wading through trash. We wanted to see if we could clean up the neighborhood, and we operated it for 6 months on a volunteer basis, and proved to Penn that it could be done. We got some money from the university for it, and so they put that on the back burner. So, those were the organizations that I concentrated on, and Mike had his own stuff.
Well, I've already mentioned that I was acting in the University City Historical Society, and in these ways. One, I was the one who got people to essentially help us design, and I always sold them, the cups. And I also was, for a long time, in charge of the newsletters. And I also sold books, West Philadelphia Illustrated. And I also helped with tours, particularly in terms of making selections for the houses that are going to be on the tours. And the way in which I did that is, I remember, I would walk down the block and find houses that had picked out the details, architectural details in a different color, right? And that seemed to me was a indicator that somebody was interested in property development, etc. So we would do that. I also was responsible for getting people to sit in the houses that were on tour. And I've been involved with the Friends of Clark Park in a number of ways, one of which essentially is to focus on the statue of Dickens and Little Nell, and I brought people from the Community College of Philadelphia to come out and give speeches, and then we would have everybody go over and put garlands on both of their heads.
This was a forerunner of what Bob Baer does.
Right, a good friend of ours is Bob Baer. At one point, the statue of Little Nell was vandalized, and her arm was pulled off, and I picked up the arm and had it stored over in a basement on Regent Square, and then we found someone to fix it, and we fixed it, and we were immediately attacked by the art people in the city, because they said you got to get a professional to do that, and we didn't have any control over who the professional was. I was on the board of UC Green, and I'm still interested in it. We have a new executive director, and I also was involved from the very beginning in tree planting in this neighborhood and in University City as a whole. We had a man by the name of S.O. Sanchez, who still lives in the neighborhood, who was the first director of UC Green. And I planted so many trees that I was honored by the Audubon Society. But
yeah, it required, the honor was required you to go out to Nebraska to pick it up.
Right.
And we did it.
Well, I shared essentially their activities of going into properties that were going to be demolished and essentially pulling out artifacts like that stained glass and also ceramic tiles, etc. And Sylvia had in mind the idea of we would eventually take all these things and have an outdoor museum, right? She had some experience with another outdoor museum of retrieved artifacts. And Ruth had the same ideas. Ruth lived on Regents on St. Mark's Square, right? And so it was in walking distance. And I was very, very, friendly with Ruth. I'm also a supporter of the Friends of Philadelphia Trolleys.
Oh.
And have been and continue to be. We took the trolleys to work. Barry walked to work.
I walked to work at Spring 70th Spring Garden.
We're also very big walkers.
Because Philadelphia is just a walkable city, and everybody, if you go over the Walnut Street Bridge, there are people walking all over the place. Their students are walking back and forth. Those who live in Center City or coming from the university or going back. So this is really a walkable city, and that's why I think this is a city of neighborhoods, because you can walk around here and you will meet people and you'll talk to people on the street, and not everybody is driving from one place to another. There are people who actually walk in the neighborhood. And I think that's consistent with a lot of Philadelphia neighborhoods. And so when they talk about Philadelphia being a city of neighborhoods, that's really what they mean.